I think the most exciting sporting event this weekend that just passed was Georgia and Alabama. And I'm going to explain to you what happened in the game. I'm going to explain to you my takes. But let me first explain why I think that was the most exciting sports event that we got this weekend. I think the answer to this question lies first with, why do we love college sports so much? Why do we love college football, college basketball so much? Yes, because of the unpredictability. Yes, because of the excitement and the adrenaline of, a close game or a powerhouse teams going at it. No, I think one of the biggest reasons why we love sports so much is because sometimes not even the fans can draw up in our minds how some of these sporting events, a lot of times college football, college basketball, how they end. But in the same breath, they end exactly the way that we would want to. Let me explain. When number 2 Georgia goes up against number 4 Alabama, what do we hope? You hope for a good game. You hope for an exciting finish. You hope for the ending to have a proper representation of both sides of the ball, and you ultimately want a good game. I think that's the underlining reason of why we love college sports. There's not a lot. There are some, but there's not many blowouts when you have two teams that are viewed to be close in talent. And that is obviously what Georgia, who was ranked number 2 going in, and Alabama, who was ranked number 4 going in, was. You don't want to blow out. We want to feel like we got our time's worth watching both of these programs go together, and that's exactly what happened. Alabama beat Georgia 41-34. Now, the final score is exactly indicative of how close the game was, but it wasn't indicative of how we got there. For people that didn't watch, I think Alabama went up 28-0, at least for sure 21-0. It was looking like it was going to be the blowout of the century, man. I don't think enough is talked about of how seamless Kellen DeBoer has transferred from Washington to Alabama. When we think of Alabama, we don't really think of a fast, we don't really think of a creative offense. We think of power. We think of just greatness. And that's no offense to Nick Saban. But when we think about the past Alabama teams, we think of greatness, but we don't really think of creativity. And again, that's no disrespect, but it's just uniformal. We do the same thing over and over again. And that formula has been successful for Alabama. And it's been successful for multiple players that have been there, whether we talk about Devontae Smith, whether we talk about Bryce Young, Tua Tagovailoa, Derrick Henry, Mark Ingram, Mac Jones. There's a successful formula that Nick Saban and the Alabama Crimson Tide has found, and they've stuck to it for years. So when you look at this Alabama team led by Jalen Milroe, coached by Kellen DeBoer, it doesn't look exactly like the uniformal Alabama that we've seen. And that's not a bad thing. And I think Georgia learned that the hard way, at least the first half of the game. When you look at these numbers, now, obviously, this is a totality of the game. But Carson, actually, let's, before we get to the numbers, going into it, there was a question of who was going to be. There are a few quarterbacks this year that will definitely find themselves in conversation, not only for the Heisman, but for high draft pick slots going into the next year's draft. And Jalen Milroe, along with Carson Beck, were two names that were talked about highly in both instances. Carson Beck, we know how it ended for Georgia last year as far as not making to the college football playoffs, as they had a undefeated season until they met Alabama, the last regular season game. Then we also know Alabama, they went to the college football playoffs and lost to Michigan. But you're bringing two quarterbacks back, like I said, Milroe in Alabama and Carson Beck in Georgia, that not only have experience, but have a plethora of weapons around them, both on the offensive side of the ball, both on the offensive line, both on the defense. So going into it, I think that this was a big game for both Beck and Milroe. Georgia has looked great, but they haven't looked like the dominant Georgia that we thought we would see. Alabama, on the other hand, it's been kind of hard to quantify what we've seen from Alabama because, again, it doesn't look like anything that we're used to when we're talking about Alabama. But we do know that we've seen greatness. We've seen greatness out of Jalen Milroe. We've seen greatness out of the 17-year-old Ryan Williams. We have seen greatness. It's kind of hard for our brains to comprehend. This is a different dominant Alabama team. So going into this game, there is we know about the movement that's been in college football, especially when we talk about the Big Ten, but there's also been movement in the SEC, adding teams like Texas, adding teams like Oklahoma. And you don't want to, how do I say this? Going into this game, one thing that we know about college football is in previous years, maybe not the last, I'll say 3 or 4, but before then, there's always been one or two teams that have very early on separated themselves from the pack. It doesn't mean the pack hasn't been good, but there's always been one or two teams that has risen fast. In fact, I will probably say last year was Michigan. Michigan, even with all the stuff going on with Jim Harbaugh, even with all the stuff going on with the sign stealing, Michigan kind of separated themselves with J.J. McCarthy, with Blake Corum. They separated themselves from the pack. And we haven't really seen that outside of last year in the last few years, but that's typically what we see. And typically, that team that separates is Alabama. And there was 2 straight years. I think it was Stetson Bennett. Georgia was on that list too, I think a few years ago, especially with Stetson Bennett. So while it is a tradition pretty much that one or two teams kind of separate because they just have better recruiting class, they have a better roster. For the last few years, outside of a few, there hasn't really been much separation. There's been more parity in college sports, more so basketball, but in college sports than anything. I think when we talk about the transfer portal, when we talk about NILs and how, smaller, less dominant schools are able to attract better players because of the deals that are attached to their school or because of the deals that a player can get if they go to said school, it has made parity much greater in the college realm. But Saturday kind of felt like there's been probably one or two teams that you can feel are kind of slipping away from the pack. And those teams have been Texas, Georgia, and Alabama. And you can kind of argue Ohio State, but when you look at the caliber and opponents, it still gives you a little bit of pause. So this game was huge for both Georgia and Alabama because we wanted to know, okay, are these two teams legit as far as are they starting to separate from the pack? And if so, which one is kind of separating further? Because right now we kind of believe that Texas has been the best team, but we're not 100% sure. Or if we are sure, we don't know necessarily how wide the gap is. Georgia going down 28 to 0 made it feel like there was such a wide gap. That was probably the most shocking thing about this Georgia-Alabama game is that Georgia was down as much as 28 points. And Trevor Etienne hasn't really had that breakout game, but when you have Aaron Smith going for 132 yards and you have Dylan Bell going for 100 yards for Georgia, it's like, yo, how in the world is there such a gap? That's why I kind of started this with shouts out to Alabama, bro. Like they are starting to they're dominating. I'm sorry. They're dominating. It just doesn't look like the dominating that we're used to seeing from an Alabama team. But then Georgia woke up. And Georgia realized, all right, we're Georgia. And they came all the way back to essentially take the lead. But because they built themselves such a hole, it was, yeah. But Carson Beck had a decent game. He threw for 439 yards. He did have 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. Jalen Milroe was on 374 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. I think the star of the game and the one that had the game-winning touchdown was Ryan Williams, who, by the way, is 17 years old. 6 receptions for 177 yards. This game had everything that you could ask for. It had a unpredictable feel to it because nobody would have predicted Georgia being down 28 to 0. It had it's like all the script writers came in and they all just started throwing to the wall their ideas. Okay, let's have a huge deficit. Let's have a team overcome that deficit and essentially take the lead. Then as soon as Georgia took the lead, I think a play or two later, Alabama comes back and scores. I feel much there. I don't believe in moral victories. I think that there are positives and negatives that you can take out of both wins and losses, but I don't really believe in moral victories. But what I will say is this. If I'm Georgia, I feel bad, but I don't feel as bad after this game as I would have done before, because I feel if you eliminate the turnovers by Carson Beck and you play the Georgia brand of football from the jump, I'm not saying that you would necessarily win, but what I am saying is it would be I don't think you'd be down 28-0. And if I'm Alabama, I'm like, yo, I think there's a reason why Alabama jumped from 4-1. And I think that also shows, seeing as though Texas is undefeated, Alabama's undefeated, there's a bunch of undefeateds, and no one has looked exceptional outside of this game. Which is why there's a lot of things that's changed after this game. The Heisman favorites have changed. The NFL draft mock drafts have changed. A lot has changed from this. I will, however, say this. if I am Georgia, like I said, there's positives and negatives you can take out of both, and I'll be skeptical on both, or I'll play the negative on both. If I'm Georgia, there were questions going in as to how you look great, but you don't look dominant. There's a reason why a team that going into Saturday was undefeated got jumped by Texas. You haven't looked exceptional. And a lot of the question marks, a lot of the issues that we have had with this Georgia team, even though they were undefeated and even though they were ranked higher than Alabama, all the issues, all the concerns that we had were realized in this game. When you look at the running game, we thought Trevor Etienne was going to have a much bigger role than he has had this year. Not saying that it won't get better, not saying that he won't get better, not saying that he won't grow as a player, but the running game has been damn near non-existent for Georgia. Don't get me wrong, bro. Carson Beck is good, but I don't think there is any plan going into a Georgia game. I don't think there is any game plan where they have Carson Beck throwing 50 times. I just don't see that happening, especially when you have a person like Trevor Etienne. And on top of that, this is probably Aaron Smith's best game. This is probably Dylan Bell's best game. Outside of that, where is the offense coming from? And I think one of the bigger question marks is the defense hasn't looked as dominant as it's looked from past years. And is that going to be a hindrance to them, or are they going to be able to overcome that? Because again, over the past few years, you've had damn near entire NFL defenses on the Georgia Bulldogs team. So there are still huge question marks coming out of Georgia, but I do feel that for Georgia, they can feel better after the game than the media is kind of putting them. Well, how do I say this? There are some positives and some negatives to take out, and depending on what side of the fence that you want to be on, I think that there are a lot of positives and there are a lot of negatives. And for Alabama, obviously the positive is when they're firing on all cylinders, when you have Jalen Milroe running. Jalen Milroe threw for 374 yards and rushed for 117 yards. Like, I don't think you understand, bro. That doesn't happen. The man almost totaled 500 yards. Like, damn. So the marriage between Kellen DeBoer and Alabama has gone perfectly. You couldn't ask for a better marriage. You couldn't ask for a more seamless transition from Washington to Alabama. You couldn't ask for a better quarterback to take the helm with a Kellen DeBoer offense like Jalen Milroe. I don't think there is a better offensive weapon outside of the quarterback position in college football right now, outside of Ryan Williams. You can talk about I forgot it. I know his name. I just don't know how to say it exactly. But the running back from Boise State definitely has a claim. But outside of him, Ryan Williams, and to be as young as he is just different. But then you can also say, all right, hold up. In the second half, we only scored 11 points to their 27. That's kind of crazy. So, shouts out and congratulations to Alabama for beating Georgia 41-34. And I think the beauty of it watching is everything that you can ask for in college football. All the excitement, the roller coaster of emotions for both sides of the ball, or both sides of the field, meaning both teams, we got. And that game was a perfect example of why people love college football so much. That was a perfect. Right now, I don't think there's, obviously it's very early, but I don't think there is a close second to game of the year. Oh man, you stayed to the end of the video. I appreciate you. If you like what you saw, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss any content from your boy. You can also go back and watch past episodes, past clips, and don't forget that the Unpopular Podcast, new episodes drop every Wednesday and Saturday. Appreciate you.